The Hall of Ascension was the oldest building in the known galaxy, and it looked like it had been carved from the bones of a dying star. Its walls were black stone, laced with veins of molten gold, and its ceiling stretched so high that clouds sometimes formed between the pillars. Real clouds that drifted and broke apart in the warm currents rising from 10,000 alien bodies packed into the observation galleries. Every species that had ever clawed its way into the stars had stood in this hall at least once, and every single one of them had been afraid when they did. Today it was humanity's turn. Ambassador Elara Voss stepped off the shuttle ramp and onto the landing platform outside the hall. And the first thing she noticed was the silence. It was not a respectful silence, or a curious silence. It was the silence of predators watching something small walk into the open. She was 46 years old, average height, dark skin, close-cropped silver hair, and she wore a simple black suit, with no armor, no energy shielding, no visible technology of any kind. In her right hand, she carried a sealed case, no larger than a shoebox. 2 conclave guards escorted her through the main corridor, each of them towering over her by at least 3 feet, their scaled bodies wrapped in ceremonial plate that hummed with low-frequency energy fields. They did not speak to her, and she did not speak to them. She had been briefed on the ceremony 100 times, had studied the recordings of every offering made in the last 1,000 years, had memorized the names and threat profiles of every species that would be watching from the galleries above. She knew exactly what she was walking into. The Hall of Ascension operated on one principle that had held true for 10,000 years. If you wanted to sit at the table of the galaxy, you had to show the galaxy what you could do to it. Every species brought a weapon. Dralith, the oldest and most feared civilization in the Conclave, had presented a singularity bomb during their own offering, a device the size of a human fist that could collapse an entire star system into a point of infinite density. The Vrenka, an insectoid empire that controlled over 200 star systems, had brought a bioweapon that could rewrite the genetic code of any carbon-based species, turning living creatures into raw organic material in a matter of hours. The Torvon, a race of towering psychic warriors, had displayed a psionic blade, a crystalline weapon that could sever a soul from a body and leave the victim alive but hollow, a breathing shell with nothing inside. Species after species, century after century, the message was always the same. Fear us, because this is what we can do to you. And the system worked. The Conclave kept peace not through treaties or laws, but through the simple mathematics of mutually assured destruction. Destruction. Everyone was afraid of everyone else, and that fear kept the galaxy in a kind of frozen order, cold and stable, and held together by the threat of annihilation. Elara walked through the final archway and into the main chamber, and 10,000 pairs of alien eyes turned to look at her. The galleries rose in concentric rings around a central platform of polished obsidian, and every ring was packed with delegates and observers from across the known galaxy. She saw the Dralith in their upper galleries, massive reptilian beings with 4 golden eyes and skin like cracked volcanic rock. She saw the Vrenka in their sealed atmospheric pods, clicking and buzzing behind transparent walls, their compound eyes tracking her every movement. She saw dozens of other species she recognized from intelligence briefings: the amphibian Myrishi, the crystalline Holeth, the gas giant-dwelling Ombrathi, floating in their pressurized spheres. Arbiter Severak was old even by Dralith standards, which meant he was ancient beyond human comprehension. He sat on a raised throne at the far end of the chamber, his body scarred and weathered, his 4 eyes burning with the cold intelligence of a being who had watched civilizations rise and fall like tides. He was the judge. He was the voice of the conclave, and he was watching Alara with an expression she could not read. She reached the central platform and stopped. The chamber fell into perfect silence. Severak spoke, and his voice was deep enough to vibrate in her chest, even from across the chamber. The species known as humanity has been detected within the boundary of conclave space, he said, and is hereby called to present its offering, that the galaxy may know what it faces. Alara looked up at him and nodded once. She had rehearsed this moment so many times that her hands did not shake. Fast, and she could feel the weight of every eye in the room, pressing down on her like gravity. She knelt and placed the sealed case on the obsidian platform. She unlatched the lid. She opened it. Inside, resting on a small cushion of dark velvet, was a glass sphere no larger than a human fist, and inside the sphere was a single cherry blossom, alive, pink, perfect, its petals soft and slightly translucent in the golden light of the chamber. A self-sustaining biosphere, a tiny closed ecosystem that kept the flower alive and blooming indefinitely. That was it. That was humanity's offering to the galaxy. For 3 full seconds, there was no sound at all. Then, the laughter began. It started with the Vren-Ka, a harsh, clicking, chittering sound that rattled through their atmospheric ponds like stones in a metal drum. It spread to the Torvan, who barked their amusement in deep, booming tones that echoed off the black walls. Within moments, the entire hall was laughing, a roaring multilingual wave of mockery that crashed over Alara from every direction. She stood still. She did not flinch. She did not look away from Severak. And Severak was not laughing. The old Draelith stared at the blossom with all 4 of his golden eyes, and something moved behind them, something the other species in the hall were too busy laughing to notice. It was not amusement. It was not contempt. Severak raised one massive clawed hand, and the hall fell silent instantly, because when the Arbiter raised his hand, you stopped whatever you were doing, or you faced consequences that no species wanted to imagine. He leaned forward on his throne, his ancient body creaking, his eyes never leaving the tiny pink flower on its velvet cushion. "In 10,000 years," he said quietly, his voice carrying through the silence like a stone dropped into still water, "no species has ever brought something alive to this hall." He looked at Alara. She looked back at him, and somewhere in the space between them, in the silence that followed his words, something shifted, something old and heavy and fundamental, like the first crack in a wall that had stood for longer than anyone could remember. The laughter did not return. The hall remained silent as Alara closed the case and lifted it from the platform and walked back the way she had come, past the guards, past the galleries, past 10,000 aliens who had stopped laughing and started thinking. And Severak watched her go, his 4 golden eyes narrowed not with amusement and not with contempt, but with something far more dangerous, something that looked very much like the beginning of fear. Within hours of the ceremony, every major communication network in conclave space was carrying the story of the strange soft-skinned species that had walked into the Hall of Ascension and presented a flower. The Vren-Ka media channels called them the petal species, and ran animated segments showing a cartoon human trying to fight a warship with a bouquet of roses. The Torvan combat academies used it as a joke in their training halls. "Fight like a human" became slang for doing something foolish and weak. On 1,000 worlds and 1,000 languages, humanity became the funniest thing the galaxy had seen in centuries. Alara watched the broadcasts from her quarters aboard the human diplomatic vessel orbiting Varith Prime, and she did not react. Her aide, a young lieutenant named Davi Okafor, paced behind her with barely contained frustration. "They are already drawing up invasion plans," he said. "At least 3 species have filed territorial claims on our home system and the Vren-Ka Dominion has moved a carrier group to within 2 jumps of Sol. I know, Ilara said. Then why are you smiling? Because they are doing exactly what we expected them to do. She turned off the broadcast and picked up the sealed case with the blossom inside and held it in her lap. Every species that has ever entered this conclave did the same thing, she said. They walked in, they showed their teeth, and the galaxy measured them by the size of their bite, and slotted them into the hierarchy accordingly. And that was that. Forever, locked in place, defined by a single moment of threat. She looked at Davi. We chose a different door, and now nobody knows where to put us, and that is the most dangerous thing we could have done. Davi did not look convinced, but he trusted her, so he said nothing more. 3 days later, an invitation arrived from the Vren-Ka Dominion. High Commander Ysilin, the Supreme Military Authority of the Vren-Ka, requested the human ambassador's presence at a formal dinner aboard the Dominion flagship Hollow Fang. It was not a request that could be refused. The Hollow Fang was a dreadnought the size of a small city, all angles and dark chitin-like plating, and the interior smelled like copper and something chemical that made Ilara's eyes water slightly. She was escorted to a long dining hall, where representatives from 6 different species sat around a curved table loaded with food and drink from a dozen worlds. Ysilin sat at the head of the table. She was magnificent and terrifying. 7 feet of segmented black carapace, 4 arms folded neatly before her, compound eyes that shifted color depending on her mood, currently a deep mocking amber. Ambassador Voss, Ysilin said, and her translator rendered her clicking speech into smooth galactic standard. We are so honored that the flower bearers could join us this evening. Polite laughter rippled through the table. Ilara sat in the chair provided, which was slightly too large for her, clearly by design. The honor is mine, High Commander, she said. The dinner proceeded with the usual diplomatic pleasantries, but everyone at the table knew it was a performance. And the main act came halfway through the second course, when Ysilin reached beneath the table and placed a disruptor pistol on the polished surface between them. It was a Vren-Ka sidearm, elegant and lethal, capable of reducing organic matter to ash at a distance of 200 meters. A gift, Ysilin said, her eyes shifting to a brighter amber. Since your species seems to have forgotten to bring anything with teeth, perhaps you could match it with a thorn from your little flower. The table went silent. Every eye turned to Ilara. She looked at the weapon. She did not touch it. I appreciate the gesture, she said, but I did not come empty-handed, High Commander. I brought a story, if you would hear it. Ysilin's mandibles clicked, in what might have been amusement or irritation. A story, she repeated. On our world, Ilara said, there is a tree called a cherry blossom, and it blooms for only a few days each year before its petals fall. It is one of the most beloved things in our culture, not because it lasts, but because it does not last. She paused and looked around the table. We are a species that builds monuments not to our victories, but to our dead. We have walls covered with the names of those we lost in wars, and we visit them, and we weep, and we teach our children about them so they will understand what it costs when a civilization chooses violence. The Mayarishi delegate, a small amphibian with wet silver skin and large dark eyes, leaned forward slightly. We split the atom, Ilara continued, which is the fundamental building block of matter, and we used it to build a weapon that could destroy cities in a single flash of light. And then we spent decades building treaties and agreements to make sure we would never use it again. She looked at Ysilin. Any species can build a thing that destroys, High Commander. The galaxy is full of species that have proven this, and the proof is sitting on your table right now. But we wanted to show the Conclave something different. And what is that? Ysilin asked, her voice flat. That we understand what it costs, Ilara said. That we have looked into the fire, and we chose, not out of weakness, but out of knowledge, to carry something gentle instead. Because the hardest thing in the universe is not destruction, High Commander. The hardest thing is choosing not to destroy when you have the power to do so. The silence that followed was long and heavy. Yiselin stared at her with those shifting compound eyes, and for a moment the amber dimmed to something cooler. Harder to read, PSP. Then she picked up the disruptor pistol and holstered it, and said nothing more on the subject. The dinner ended shortly after. But, as Alara left the Hollow Fang, she noticed the Marishi delegate waiting near the airlock, those large dark eyes watching her with an expression that was not mockery and not pity, but something that looked very much like hope. "Ambassador Voss," the Marishi said in a quiet, bubbling voice, "my people have served the Vrenka for 400 years. We were conquered because we were small, and we had no great weapon to present at our own offering." She paused. "No one has ever said what you said in that room. No one has ever suggested that there is strength in anything other than the ability to kill." Alara looked at her and felt the weight of what she was carrying. Not just the blossom in its case, but the idea it represented, fragile and enormous at the same time. "What is your name?" Alara asked. "Tiavesh," the Marishi said. "Tiavesh, I think there are more species in this galaxy who feel the way you do than anyone realizes. They have just been afraid to say it." Tiavesh blinked her dark eyes and said nothing, but she touched Alara's hand briefly with her cool, wet fingers before disappearing back into the ship. 2 days later, Severak the Arbiter sent a private communication to Alara's vessel, requesting a meeting in his personal chambers on Verath Prime. She went alone. His chambers were vast and dark and smelled like old stone, and he sat in a pool of dim golden light, his massive body still, his 4 eyes watching her approach. 10,000 years, he said without greeting. "I have overseen this conclave for 10,000 years, and in that time I have seen 412 species present their offerings." He leaned forward. "Every single one brought a weapon, every single one, without exception, until you." "Does that concern you?" Alara asked. "It terrifies me," Severak said, and his voice was so quiet she almost did not hear it. "Because I do not understand it, and in 10,000 years I have learned that the things I do not understand are the things that change everything." Alara returned to her ship that evening and found Davi waiting with a face like ash. "Intelligence just came in from Earth Command," he said. 14 species have formed a coalition. They are calling it a preemptive security action." He swallowed. "They are building an invasion fleet, Ambassador. They are coming for Earth." Alara looked at the blossom in its glass sphere, still pink, still perfect, still quietly alive. "Then I suppose," she said, "it is time for the galaxy to learn that flowers can grow in places that are not safe." The Coalition fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Sol system on a Tuesday morning, Earth time, and for a brief moment, the commanders aboard those ships believed they were looking at an empty stretch of cold space with nothing in it but dust and silence. They were wrong. Admiral Kofiansa stood on the bridge of the carrier Steadfast and watched the sensor board light up as 230 alien warships settled into formation near the orbit of Neptune. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with deep brown skin and a shaved head, and calm, steady eyes that never seemed to move faster than they needed to. "Composition," he said. "Vrenka heavy carriers make up the core," his tactical officer replied, "supported by Torvan assault cruisers and a mixed screen of mercenary corvettes from at least 6 different species. Total tonnage is roughly 4 times our own." "Roughly," Ansa repeated. "Yes, sir," and looked at the display where the Coalition fleet was arranging itself into a standard Vrenka assault pattern, a broad crescent designed to envelop a target from 3 sides and crush it inward. It was a textbook formation. Humans had studied Vrenka textbooks very carefully. "Signal all ships," Ansa said. "Execute contingency orchard." The Coalition fleet expected to find a frightened world hiding behind a handful of patrol boats. What they found instead was a defense network that had been quietly built over the last 50 years by a species that had been preparing for this exact scenario since the day they first detected signals from beyond their solar system. Stealth minefields activated across a 1,000-kilometer band between Neptune and Uranus. Not explosive mines, but electromagnetic disruptors that scrambled navigation systems and forced ships to slow to a crawl or risk flying blind. Defense platforms hidden in the asteroid belt powered up. Small, hard to detect. Each one carrying a weapons package designed not to destroy capital ships, but to cripple their engines and communications arrays. And the human fleet, 62 ships in total, moved out from behind the shadow of Jupiter's moons, where they had been running silent for 3 days. The Coalition's first mistake was assuming that a species that brought a flower to the conclave would not know how to fight. Their second mistake was assuming that human ships would fight the way everyone else in the galaxy fought, head-on, formation against formation, biggest gun wins. Humans did not fight like that. The first engagement happened near the rings of Saturn, when a wing of 12 human destroyers appeared out of nowhere behind the Coalition's rear guard and opened fire on their engine sections before vanishing back into the electromagnetic noise of the rings. The Vrenka commanders tried to regroup, but their hive-mind coordination, normally their greatest advantage, became a vulnerability when human electronic warfare ships began broadcasting interference patterns specifically designed to disrupt the chemical signals the Vrenka used to synchronize their fleet movements. For the first time in centuries, Vrenka captains had to think for themselves, and most of them had never been trained to do that. The Torvon fared better. They were individual warriors, each ship commanded by a single psychic pilot, and they charged the human lines with savage ferocity. But the humans had prepared for them too. When the Torvon assault cruisers closed to psionic range, they found that every human ship was broadcasting a wall of chaotic neural static. Music, mathematics, poetry, random emotional noise from thousands of human minds piped through amplifiers that made it impossible for the Torvon pilots to focus their psychic abilities. The battle raged for 11 hours. Human ships darted, retreated, and struck from unexpected angles, using the planets and moons and asteroid fields as cover, and turning the familiar geography of their home system into a maze of ambush points. They lost ships. 23 human vessels were destroyed in the fighting, and over 4,000 crew members died in the cold silence between the planets they had grown up watching in their night skies. But they fought with something the Coalition had never encountered before. A creativity that bordered on insanity, a willingness to improvise and adapt and try things that no tactical manual would ever recommend. The moment that broke the Coalition's spirit happened 6 hours into the battle, when the Vrenka carrier World Render was bearing down on a cluster of damaged human frigates. A single human corvette, the Dandelion, broke formation and accelerated directly toward the World Render on a collision course. The Vrenka tried to shoot it down, but the Dandelion was small and fast, and its pilot flew with the kind of reckless precision that only someone who has already accepted death can achieve. At the last moment, the crew of the Dandelion ejected in their escape pods. All 47 of them launched into space in a burst of white capsules that scattered like seeds from a broken flower. 3 seconds later, the empty Dandelion struck the World Render's command spire at full speed. The explosion tore the spire apart and killed the carrier's command staff instantly, and the World Render, the pride of the Vrenka fleet, drifted to a halt, blind and leaderless. The Coalition fleet froze. They had fought species that were desperate before, species that clawed and bit and screamed as they died. But they had never fought a species that could calmly choose to give up a ship, that could look at destruction and calculate its value, and decide exactly how and when to sacrifice, not out of desperation, but out of strategy. It was the difference between an animal thrashing in a trap and a gardener deciding which branch to prune. and it terrified them. The battle turned. The coalition's mercenary ships began retreating first, unwilling to die for a contract against an enemy this unpredictable. The Torvon pulled back next, their psychic pilots shaken and exhausted from fighting through the neural static. And then Admiral Ansah did the thing that no one expected. He opened a broadcast on every frequency: human, Vrenka, Torvon, every language the translation systems could handle. "This is Admiral Kofi Ansah of the Human Defense Fleet," he said, and his voice was steady and calm, and carried no anger and no triumph. "We are offering an immediate ceasefire to all coalition forces. Stand down your weapons, and we will stand down ours." He paused. "Any vessel that is damaged or disabled will receive assistance. We are dispatching search and rescue ships to recover escape pods and survivors from all sides of this engagement, regardless of species." He paused again. "You came to our home to destroy us, and we will not pretend that is something we can easily forgive. But we will not become the thing you expected us to be. We will not slaughter those who cannot fight back, and we will not leave the wounded to die in the dark." Half the coalition accepted within minutes. The Vrenka did not respond at all, but their remaining ships turned and jumped to faster-than-light speed and disappeared, leaving their damaged vessels and escape pods behind. And the human fleet moved in, not to loot, not to capture prisoners, but to rescue. The footage spread across the galaxy within hours. Human medics in light emergency suits, cutting open the wreckage of Vrenka carriers, and pulling wounded insectoid soldiers from the debris. Careful with their fragile limbs, gentle with their damaged carapace. Human doctor, a woman named Priya Sen, small and exhausted and covered in alien blood that was not red, kneeling beside a dying Torvon warrior 3 times her size, holding his massive clawed hand, while she administered painkillers that her team had synthesized on the spot, because human medicine did not work on Torvon biology, and they had to figure it out in real time. A group of human engineers repairing the life support system of a crippled mercenary corvette, whose crew had been shooting at them 4 hours earlier. The galaxy watched. Billions of beings on thousands of worlds watched a species that had been laughed at and mocked and dismissed as soft and foolish, a species that had brought a flower to a hall of weapons, pull its enemies from the wreckage, and treat their wounds, and keep them alive. And something shifted. Not in the halls of power, not in the war rooms and command centers, where the old equations of fear still held, but in the streets, in the homes, in the quiet places where ordinary beings on ordinary worlds watched the footage and felt something crack open inside them. Something that had been locked away for so long they had forgotten it was there. The Mirishi homeworld erupted in protests the same day, millions of amphibian citizens flooding the rain-soaked streets, demanding independence from the Vrenka Dominion. On the Torvon border worlds, warriors who had survived the battle refused to speak ill of the humans, and were stripped of their rank for it. And in her quarters aboard the diplomatic vessel still orbiting Verath Prime, Ilara Voss watched the footage of Priya Sen holding the dying warrior's hand, and wept quietly, not because it was sad, but because it was exactly what she had hoped humanity would do when the moment came. The blossom in its glass sphere sat on the table beside her, pink and alive, and still blooming in the dark. The galaxy after the Battle of Sol was not the same galaxy that had existed before it. The old order did not collapse overnight. Empires built on 10,000 years of fear do not simply fall apart because someone showed mercy on a battlefield. But something had cracked, deep and structural, like a fault line running through the foundation of a building that still looked solid from the outside, but was no longer what it had been. The Mirishi were the first to move. 3 weeks after the battle, the Mirishi Collective formally severed its vassal bond with the Vrenka Dominion, and transmitted a request for diplomatic relations with Earth. It was the first time in 400 years that a subjugated species had broken free from Vrenka control, And the reason it worked was that the Vrenka were too weakened and too humiliated to stop it. High Commander Yselin retreated to the inner territories of the Dominion and sealed the borders and said nothing publicly, but intelligence reports suggested that she had executed 3 of her own admirals for the failure at Sol, and was consolidating power with a fury that made even her own officers afraid. The Torvan were more complicated. Their warrior culture did not know how to process what had happened. They had been defeated in battle, which they could accept, but they had been rescued by the species that defeated them, which broke something in their understanding of how the universe worked. A faction of younger Torvan warriors began calling themselves the Open Hand, rejecting the old doctrine that strength was measured only in what you could destroy, and the older generation called them traitors, and the divide between them grew wider every day. And humanity, to the shock and confusion of almost everyone, did not act like a species that had just won a war. They did not demand territory. They did not seize the damaged coalition ships as prizes, not even demand reparations. Instead, they did something that baffled the galactic community so thoroughly that several species convened emergency councils just to try to understand it. They offered help. Earth's agricultural scientists shared drought-resistant crop designs with 3 famine-stricken worlds in the Outer Rim, species that had nothing to offer in return and had never even heard of humanity before the conclave ceremony. Human medical teams traveled to Marishi hospitals and worked alongside amphibian doctors to develop treatments for a plague that had been killing Marishi children for decades, a plague the Vrenka had never bothered to address because dead Marishi were easier to replace than living ones. And on a moon of Jupiter, in a facility that had originally been designed as a military research station, humanity established the Voss Institute, the first cross-species university in galactic history, named after an ambassador who was still very much alive, much to her embarrassment. "You could have named it after someone dead," Alara told the committee that had made the decision. "We could have," they replied, "but we wanted the galaxy to know that the person behind this is still here, still working, still believing in what she started." The Institute opened its doors to students and scholars from any species willing to attend, and within 6 months it had applicants from 47 different worlds, including, to everyone's surprise, a small group of Torvan from the Open Hand faction who wanted to study something other than war for the first time in their civilization's history. The effect rippled outward. A loose coalition of smaller species, the Marishi, the Holoth, several others who had spent centuries at the bottom of the galactic hierarchy, began organizing around a shared set of principles that someone, half-jokingly, called the Blossom Doctrine. The idea was simple, radical, that a civilization's worth should be measured not by what it could destroy, but by what it chose to nurture. It was not a formal alliance, and it had no military component, and the old powers of the conclave dismissed it as sentimental nonsense. But it kept growing, and the speed of its growth made certain beings very nervous. Severak watched all of this from his chambers on Verath Prime, with the careful attention of someone who had seen 10,000 years of galactic history and recognized the early tremors of something that could reshape all of it. He did not announce his visit to Earth. He arrived quietly, on a small Dralith shuttle, with no guards and no ceremony, and he asked to see one thing: a garden. The humans took him to Kyoto, to a temple garden that had existed for over 500 years, and they left him there alone because he asked them to. He walked among the trees. He was enormous, 12 feet tall, his cracked skin gleaming in the dappled sunlight, and he was here for one reason: to understand what humans chose to cultivate. Volcanic skin and golden eyes, utterly alien against the green moss and wooden gates, and he moved with a slowness that was not weakness, but reverence, placing each massive foot with care, so as not to crush the delicate ground cover. He found the cherry trees. It was spring, and they were in full bloom, and the air was thick with pale pink petals drifting down like snow made of silk. Severac stood beneath them and looked up, and the petals fell on his scarred, ancient face, and something happened that had not happened in so long he did not even recognize it at first. He wept. The tears that ran down his volcanic skin were not water, but something thicker, something golden, and they hissed faintly when they fell on the stone path at his feet. He wept, and he did not know why, except that something in the sight of those fragile blossoms falling freely from their branches, beautiful and temporary and completely unafraid of their own ending, reached into a part of him that he had sealed away so long ago that he had forgotten it existed. Alara found him there an hour later. She did not speak. She simply stood beside him, under the falling petals, and waited. The Draelith were not always what we are now, Severac said finally, his deep voice rough and quiet. Before the Conclave, before the wars, before the singularity bombs and the conquest fleets, we were gardeners. He looked down at his massive clawed hands. We grew things. It was our gift, our joy, the thing that made us who we were. And then we went to the stars, and we learned that the universe was full of species that wanted to kill us, and we decided that the only way to survive was to become the thing that everything else was afraid of. He closed his 4 eyes. And it worked, and we survived, and we built an empire, and somewhere along the way, we forgot that we had ever been anything else. He opened his eyes and looked at Ilara. Your flower reminded me, he said, and I am not sure whether to thank you or to curse you for it, because remembering is the most painful thing I have done in 10,000 years. Pain means it still matters, Ilara said. Severac looked at her for a long time, and then looked back up at the cherry blossoms falling in the gentle spring wind. Yes, he said, I suppose it does. He returned to Verath Prime the next day, and he told no one what he had seen or felt, but something in his eyes had changed, and the beings who knew him best noticed it and did not know what to make of it. Meanwhile, in the deep territories of the galaxy, far from Earth and far from the Conclave, the old guard was meeting in secret. 12 species, the most powerful, the most entrenched, the most invested in the system of fear that had kept them on top for millennia, gathered on a hidden station in the void between star systems. They were afraid and afraid. Beings with great power are the most dangerous things in the universe. The humans are not a military threat, the Vrenka representative said. We could rebuild and crush them if that were the only problem. The problem is the idea. The Blossom Doctrine, another delegate spat the words like poison. It is spreading, the Vrenka continued. Subjugated species are breaking free. Our own populations are questioning the old ways, and if this continues, the entire structure of the Conclave will collapse within a generation. Then we do not attack the humans, said a voice from the back of the room, a Holoth dissident, crystalline and cold. We attack the idea. They spent 6 months building it in secret, a mimetic weapon, a device that could broadcast a signal through subspace that would reach every neural network in the galaxy and rewrite the patterns associated with empathy, compassion, and cooperative instinct. It would not kill anyone, would simply make them forget why they had ever cared about anything other than survival and power. It would erase the Blossom Doctrine, not from history, but from the hearts of every being who had begun to believe in it. And when it was ready, they planned to activate it at the one moment when the galaxy would be watching. At the next gathering of the Conclave, 1 year to the day after a human ambassador had opened a small case and shown the universe a flower. 1 year to the day after she had first walked into the Hall of Ascension, Ilara Voss walked in again. The hall looked the same, the black stone walls, the golden veins, the towering galleries packed with delegates from across the galaxy. But the atmosphere was different now. charged with a tension that hummed like a wire about to snap. She carried the same case. Inside it, the cherry blossoms still bloomed, pink and perfect, alive in its tiny glass world, as if time had decided to leave it alone. The galleries were fuller than they had been a year ago, because this was no longer just a ceremony. It was a confrontation, and everyone knew it. The old guard species sat in their upper tiers, the Vren-Ka behind their atmospheric barriers, the militant Holith faction glittering like knives in the dim light, and a dozen other powers who had built their civilizations on the simple principle that fear was the only currency that mattered. The lower galleries, for the first time in conclave history, were the others, the Marishi and their silver delegation, the open-hand Torvand, with their ritual scars covered in white cloth as a sign of peace, students from the Voss Institute wearing the simple gray robes of scholars, and representatives from 40 worlds that had adopted some version of the Blossom Doctrine in the past year. And in the center of it all, on his ancient throne, sat Severak. His 4 golden eyes moved slowly across the chamber, taking in the divide that had split the galaxy into 2 halves, those who clung to the old way, and those who were reaching towards something new, and his expression was unreadable. Ilara reached the central platform and stopped. She did not open the case yet. 1 year ago, she said, and her voice carried through the silence, I stood here and showed you a flower, and you laughed. She looked up at the galleries, laughing, and some of you have stopped, and the difference between those 2 groups is the reason we are all here today. In the upper galleries, the Vren-Ka representative, not Yselin herself, who had refused to attend, but a senior commander named Kreveth, leaned forward and spoke. You are here because your species has disrupted 10,000 years of stability with a naive fantasy, Kreveth said, his translator rendering his clicks into sharp, precise words. The conclave was built on a system that works, mutual deterrence, balance of power, order through strength, and you have undermined it with sentimental propaganda. Has it worked? Ilara asked. 10,000 years of fear, and how many species have gone extinct in that time? How many worlds have been burned? How many civilizations have been ground into dust because they were too small to threaten anyone? She looked at the Myreshi delegation. 400 years of servitude, she said. You were gentle, and the Vren-Ka were not, and the system said that made you lesser. Tiavesh, the Marishi delegate she had met on the Hollow Fang a year ago, met her eyes and held them. The system did not keep the peace, Ilara continued. It kept the powerful comfortable and the weak silent, and you called that order because the screaming happened where you did not have to hear it. The hall erupted into shouting, a dozen species talking over each other, accusations flying in languages the translators could barely keep up with. And in the chaos, Kreveth gave a signal. Deep beneath the Hall of Ascension, in a chamber that had been secretly prepared over the past 6 months, a device the size of a small room hummed to life. The mimetic weapon. It was elegant in its cruelty, a subspace emitter tuned to the neural frequencies of every known species in the galaxy, designed to broadcast a signal that would reach every mind within range, systematically suppress the neural patterns associated with empathy, compassion, and cooperative bonding. It would not kill. It would not cause pain. It would simply make every being in the galaxy wake up the next morning and wonder why they had ever cared about anything other than their own survival. The Blossom Doctrine would not be remembered as a movement that was crushed. It would simply be forgotten, like a dream that fades in the first seconds of waking. Kreveth smiled as the shouting in the hall covered the faint vibration of the device powering up beneath their feet. But Ilara felt it. She did not know what it was, not exactly, but she felt the vibration in the floor, and she saw Kreveth's expression, and she understood in a single cold instant what was happening. She looked at Severak. He looked back at her, and she saw in his 4 golden eyes that he knew too. They are going to try to erase it, she said, not to the crowd, but to him, quietly enough that only he could hear. Yes, he said. Will it work? Severak was silent for a moment. No, he said. The device activated. A pulse of energy rippled outward through subspace, invisible and silent, passing through the walls of the hall and out into the galaxy beyond, spreading at faster than light speed toward every world and every mind it could reach. And nothing happened. The Marishi delegates did not suddenly forget why they were there. The open-hand Torvon did not reach for weapons that were no longer at their sides. The students from the Voss Institute did not stop caring about the knowledge they had traveled across the stars to find. Nothing changed, because the weapon had been designed to suppress something that could be forced on people from the outside. A compliance, a behavior, a conditioned response. But what the humans had sparked was not any of those things. Choice. The Mireshi had not chosen freedom because a signal told them to. They had chosen it because they had seen a human medic kneel beside a dying enemy and hold his hand. And something inside them had recognized that as true. And they had decided, freely, with their own minds and their own hearts, that they wanted to live in a galaxy where that was possible. The Torvon of the open hand had not rejected violence because someone reprogrammed them. They had rejected it because a human corvette crew had chosen to sacrifice their ship rather than take more lives than necessary. And that act of precise and deliberate mercy had shown them a kind of strength they had never imagined. You cannot erase a choice. You cannot suppress a decision that someone made with their eyes open and their mind clear. You cannot unmake what a free being has freely chosen to believe. The weapon pulsed and found nothing to grip. In the chamber below the hall, the device overloaded and went dark. Krevitz stared at the gallery, waiting for the change that was supposed to come. And when it did not come, his compound eyes shifted from amber to a color that the translator could only render as the Vrenka word for despair. The hall fell silent again, and Severak stood. He rose from his throne for the first time in anyone's living memory. All 12 feet of him, ancient and scarred and trembling with something that was not weakness, but emotion, raw and overwhelming and 10,000 years overdue. He stepped down from the throne platform. He walked to the center of the hall, and he reached behind his back and drew out an object that every species in the galaxy recognized. The Drelith Singularity Bomb, the original, the one that had been presented in this very hall 10,000 years ago as the offering that founded the Conclave. He held it in his massive clawed hands. This weapon that could collapse a star system into nothing. And he looked at it with all 4 of his golden eyes, and then he looked at Ilara. "I was a gardener once," he said. He placed the bomb on the obsidian floor. He pressed a sequence into its surface, and he deactivated it, permanently, irreversibly, in front of every species in the galaxy. The silence that followed was the loudest thing the Hall of Ascension had ever contained. Then the Myrishi delegate, Tiavesh, stood and walked to the center of the hall, and removed from her robes a small crystalline vial, the last sample of a Myrishi neurotoxin that her species had developed in secret centuries ago. The one weapon they had kept hidden through 400 years of subjugation. She placed it on the floor beside the bomb. One of the open-hand Torvon followed, laying down a psionic blade. Then, a Holoth dissident, placing a shard of their species' most destructive resonance crystal on the growing pile. One by one, they came. Not all of them, not even most of them. The Vrenka delegation left the hall in silence, and several other old guard species followed, and Ilara knew that the galaxy had not been saved in a single moment, that there would be years and decades of struggle ahead, that fear would not release its grip on 10,000 years of history without a fight. But enough of them came, enough weapons were laid down, enough beings chose, freely and openly and with full knowledge of what it meant, to try something different. And when the pile of weapons on the obsidian floor had grown large enough to mean something, Elara walked forward and opened her case and placed the cherry blossom at the center of it all, a tiny glass sphere with a single pink flower inside, alive and blooming among the instruments of death, like the first green shoot breaking through scorched earth. Severac looked down at the blossom, and then looked out at the hall, at the divided galaxy watching from their galleries, at the future that was terrifying and uncertain, and more alive than anything he had felt in 10,000 years. "It seems," he said, and his ancient voice cracked on the words, "that we have a great deal of gardening to do." Years passed. The Hall of Ascension was renamed the Hall of Offerings, and the weapons remained where they had been placed, a monument and a reminder, with the cherry blossom at their center, still blooming, always blooming. And one day a new species arrived, small, tentacled, trembling with nervousness, newly spacefaring, and utterly terrified of the vast and ancient galaxy they had stumbled into. They carried a weapon, because every piece of information they had gathered about the conclave told them that this was what was expected. But when they entered Bahal and saw the pile of deactivated weapons, and the living flower at the center, and the arbiter who had once been a conqueror and was now something gentler, they hesitated. They set the weapon down, and from their robes they drew something else, something they had brought just in case, hoping but not daring to believe that there might be a place for it. It was a song. They sang it there in the Hall of Offerings, a melody that had no words in any language the translators could parse. But every being in the room understood it anyway, because some things do not need translation. The galaxy was learning a new language, and somewhere in the center of it all, a cherry blossom kept blooming, fragile, temporary, alive, proof that the most powerful thing in the universe was never the ability to destroy. It was the courage to choose, against all evidence and against all odds, to create something beautiful instead.